Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, I will be targeting fall run saltwater stripers. This time of year in the Bay Area particularly, the stripers will be running really close to the bank as long as the angler is willing to chase the tides. I am fishing 2 hours before high tide and slack tide, and I will fish an hour after the slack tide. I will be targeting these fall run fish with a small rip bait or a jerkbait. The jerkbait of choice I will be using is the Dual Saltwater Series Sardine Edition. I have changed the hook out to the saltwater style hook, and the rod and reel I am using today is a medium setup Shimano Zodiac with a 3000 size reel loaded with 20-pound braid. It is an hour before the tide starts to change to high tide, so with that being said, I know that a lot of fish will start to parallel the bank. The first thing I like to do in the morning prior to the tide shift is I like to target the jerkbait to as close to the bank as possible, and with that the result was instant. I instantly hooked up and I knew this was a small keeper size striper. I am not retaining any fish today, but there is a lot of these fish near the bank this time of year if the angler is willing to chase the tides. These fish in the fall will be feeding heavily to try and put on weight prior to migrating back into our delta system. So with that being said, this time of year they are extremely voracious and they can be caught quite easily in the salt. A lot of anglers will often say saltwater striper is the supreme form of fishing over freshwater striper. But I believe that is a lie, because particularly from my experience, saltwater stripers are extremely aggressive, far more than when they enter freshwater. This is a small keeper fish, but I'm not retaining any fish today, so I will show him to you guys real quick, and I will let him go. Thanks for playing, buddy. Off you go. In the fall, I like to treat the saltwater striper fishing the same way I would treat any kind of black bass fishing. I have found that these fish will pin bait very close to the bank, and more often than not, a slow cadence is not needed. I will fish a very fast cadence to try and get the striper to react. I got bit instantly again, and I knew that these fish were corralling bait near the bank again. This is a smaller fish and definitely not a keeper, but they are still extremely fun on light tackle. I'm not fishing a leader today because most of the fish I know in this area are going to be smallish keeper size, probably around 18 to 20 inches with a few shakers in the mix. Therefore, I will boat flip most of them or just bank flip them to me. These diaper stripers, as I call them, are extremely aggressive. I'll show them to you guys real quick. They are very pretty, but I call them diaper stripers because they'll often be the most aggressive fish out of the school. Alright buddy, off you go. With fall being here at last, and it's finally cold enough out in the Bay Area to wear a heavier jacket, I know that the stripers will be pinning bait very close to the bank. Therefore, on my retrieve, I will work this bait as close to the bank as I can without ever stopping the retrieve until it is within eyesight. And as expected, this striper, the baby diaper striper, picked up the bait right as soon as it entered the shoreline. This is a great example of why you shouldn't stop the retrieve. More often than not, these fish will attack the bait right on the shoreline. This is another diaper striper, and I'll show them to you guys real quick as well, because there are plenty of these around, but there are some keepers around along with some bigger fish, so I will try and catch a bigger fish. Off you go, little guy. One of the hardest things to do this time of year in the salt is to differentiate and try to catch a schoolie size fish or a bigger fish from these diaper stripers. And what I have found is that with a jerkbait, I will often catch some of the schoolie size fish over a large majority of the diaper striper. But sometimes these diaper stripers are extremely aggressive, and I know I hooked another diaper striper. They are extremely fun on this light tackle, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. So I will land this fish and I will show him to you guys. Yes, even with the spinning rod, I'm able to just bank flip him immediately to me. This is a small diaper striper, but nonetheless, he is very pretty still. Thanks for playing, buddy. I'll let you off back to the salt. Later, dude. Even though I live on the west coast, I find that driving out to the sea is still quite a bit of ways for me. I particularly hate the traffic, so therefore I don't often make the trip out to the sea as much as I'd like. Although the saltwater striper fishing is probably one of my favorite pastimes. I ended up hooking another small keeper, and this fish actually struck right on the bank. This is actually a very small keeper size fish. In our state of California, and especially out in the bay, it is still an 18-inch size limit to keep with 2 fish per day. I am not retaining any fish, but there are a lot of anglers that will fish these seawalls. They will load buckets of these fish, not knowing that the regulation is still the same with 2 fish at 18 inches each. As I've mentioned before, on this channel I fish according to the laws and regulation in place, whether by state, federal, or counties. But I'm just pointing it out there because there are quite a few folks who will come out to the ocean and claim it as part of federal property and therefore not obey state law. If I were retaining fish, this will be the typical size I'd retain. On the west coast, we call these schoolies, but on the east coast, these will be severely undersized. Compared to the east and west, I find that most fish between 18 to 22 inches will be my preference if I were to take fish. But I'm not retaining any today, so you are lucky, guy. Off you go, buddy. So in this situation, I noticed that there was quite a bit of anchovies that was being corralled out there by the stripers. Particularly when I notice that there is surface activity, I will work the bait extremely fast in hope that a striper will break away from the chase and end up chasing this lure. This is another schoolie size striper. A lot of folks will often ask if there are bigger fish around the bay this time of year, and yes, there are bigger fish around the bay this time of year, but the area I'm targeting today seems to be loaded with some shakers and schoolies in the mix. But I am not a trophy hunter, so I'm just happy to catch the schoolie size fish. I like the action, therefore this is what I'm chasing in the morning. This is another nice little schoolie size fish, but I will show him to you guys real quick and then I will prep him for release. Thanks for playing, dude. Off you go. The tide shift today is a very important factor when chasing these saltwater striper from the bank. A lot of anglers will show up randomly throughout the day, but the best anglers will know that you must chase the tide for success, especially when pursuing these saltwater striper. These striper will often feed when the tide is shifting, whether it is an incoming tide or an outgoing tide. The angler should time their trip around the tides for maximum success. This is another nice schoolie size striper. I particularly prefer to chase these schoolie size fish with a jerkbait rather than a jig or a swim bait, because more oftentimes than not with a jig and a jerkbait, I find that a jig will often miss a lot of these fish, whereas with a jerkbait I will land a large portion of these fish. Another technique I will eventually demonstrate is spoon fishing. The spoon is a very underrated lure in the Bay Area, with not a lot of anglers knowing how to fish a spoon on the West Coast. This is another gorgeous little schoolie fish. He is a keeper size fish, but again, I'm not retaining any fish, so he is one lucky guy. Thanks for playing, buddy. Off you go. A lot of viewers and subscribers whom have often seen my episodes will seem to notice that I catch and release a lot. The reason I catch and release a lot is because I particularly only like to eat fresh fish, and when possible, I would like to have my fish fresh rather than have it stored away in the freezer for long periods of time. That's why I tend to catch and release about 90% of the time when I'm out there. But don't get me wrong, when I am in the mood for fish, I will go out there and harvest me fresh fish. These shakers that are in the salt water are a lot more voracious, I find, than their freshwater counterpart. They will often gun down the bait and will get hooked whether or not the angler likes it. This is a small shaker, but he is very pretty nonetheless. Off you go, little guy. Whenever regulations allow and there is no restriction, I particularly will fish almost all my lures with treble hooks. Some anglers may ask, how come I don't use single hooks whenever I'm striper fishing out in the salt for ease of catch and release? But the reason I don't like the single hooks out in the salt is when it gets snagged. I find that if I were to snag up on the rocks, a single hook will not allow me to free the lure, whereas with a treble hook, I'm able to bend out the hooks and manage to get my lure back. That is one of the main reasons why I prefer to fish with treble hook. Despite taking longer to unhook the fish, I find that I can save myself quite a bit of lures rather than the hassle of breaking off long leaders and lures on the rocks. This is a small little shaker striper, but very pretty nonetheless. Off you go, buddy. With saltwater striper fishing, I find that the best success I often will have is I will constantly move around to try and find bigger fish. These fish will run in schools of typically 10 to 50 fish, so when hooking small shakers or diaper stripers, after a few fish, I will eventually move along the rock wall and look for bigger fish. These shakers are so aggressive, they will often self-hook themselves whether or not I set the hook. They will often gun down the jerkbait all the way to the bank, and sometimes I have seen them hop completely onto the rocks. I'll show this little guy to you guys real quick, and I'll let him go. He is very pretty and very bright. That's one thing about these saltwater fishes that I really love. Thanks for playing, buddy. Off you go. The tide has completely slacked out, and now I know that I will have an hour or so before the tide starts shifting to a low tide. With this being said, I know that I must hurry because the bite window will slowly diminish. I finally ended up hooking into another schoolie size fish again. In the fall, the fish size will be almost unpredictable. One moment I could be catching shaker, and one moment I could be catching schoolies, and the next moment I might end up hooking a very large female. That is the beauty I find in saltwater striper fishing. I never know what I'll get, and I'm always happy to catch a nice sized schoolie. I don't know how this fish ended up wrapping himself. Nonetheless, he is a very pretty schoolie sized fish. I'll show him to you guys real quick before I return him back to the water. This is a very pretty schoolie sized fish. Thanks for playing, buddy. Off you go. Hopefully today's episode helped those anglers that are struggling trying to target stripers out in the salt. This time of year, especially in the fall, these stripers are extremely easy to target from the bank if an angler were to understand the tide chart. I ended up hooking another dinky sized striper. If the salmon season were open, I would be targeting salmon this time of year, but unfortunately the salmon season is closed and the sturgeon season is under weird regulation, so therefore I will be targeting striper through this latter half of the fall. This is another very pretty aggressive shaker fish. I'll show him to you guys real quick and I'll get him back in the water. There's quite a lot of these guys around, so I'll take what I can get. Thanks for playing, buddy. Off you go. I noticed that there were more fish hopping further away from the bank as the tide begins to shift to a low tide. Therefore, I will begin to cast outward and not near the bank no more. Another thing I've noticed too is more often than not, whenever I'm targeting an outgoing tide, I tend to catch a lot more shakers or diaper stripers than I do with the schoolies or the larger fish. I don't know why, but in my experience, with the outgoing tide, I tend to catch smaller fishes rather than the larger fish. This is another shaker fish, but he is very pretty nonetheless. Show him to you guys real quick again, and I'll throw him back in the water. Alright, little buddy, off you go. Fall fishing is nonetheless in full swing here in Northern California. Whether you're a freshwater angler or a saltwater angler, and if you don't take up hunting with a rifle or bow, then fishing is only going to get better in these next few weeks. All forms of fishing are currently open right now, with the exception of the salmon closure and the funky open sturgeon season. So, hopefully this episode helped those of you guys whom are just trying to decide on what species to target. Saltwater striper is among one of my favorite target species in the fall. This is another nice schoolie fish. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'm not retaining him, so off he goes. Later, buddy. Overall, it was a great day out on the saltwater. I caught a few schoolie sized striper and quite a bit of dinky sized diaper striper, but nonetheless, it was a great day on the water. Fall fishing is only going to get better as the weather cools and progresses throughout this month into early November. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, tight lines y'all.